Hey, everybody, welcome to the Exit Podcast. This is Dr. Bennett, joined here by David Kilcullen. He's one of the world's foremost counterinsurgency experts. He's a professor, he owns several companies, and he reached out to us early, I think last year, after the recording of the podcast about his book, Out of the Mountains. We've since done another episode on the dragons and the snakes, and he has graciously agreed to come on the show and talk about some of the insights from his books and also kind of what he's seeing in the geopolitical situation right now. So, welcome, David.
Hey, it's great to be back again.
Awesome. So, I want to start with the inauguration, the executive orders. You said offline that you're sort of cautiously optimistic or open-minded as to whether or not all this is going to work. You in the end of your book, Dragons and Snakes, you lay out a handful of paths the U.S. could take, and if I'm remembering them right, one of them is sort of like maintain course and speed right off the cliff, just sort of drive it into the ground. One of them
Mm.
is a retrenchment, a pulling back, and one of them is sort of what it sounds like you're hoping for, which is like a Byzantine model where we sort of utilize our existing assets really creatively, we reconfigure, and we squeeze another 1,000 years of juice out of this thing.
Mm.
And given the sort of political sea change, I wanted to get your take on like, has that actually adjust? Like, first of all, where were you before the election in terms of your expectations of what you thought would happen? Has the election changed that? Has the inauguration changed that? Like the sort of aggressive actions that he's taken in the last 4 days.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great set of questions. I'm thinking back to what I wrote in that last chapter of Dragons and Snakes, and I mean, I think I had a number of options. One being like embrace the suck, like just recognize that we're going to decline, and either just try to manage decline or just go with the flow. I think that's pretty much where the Biden administration has been, certainly in terms of both domestic and foreign policy. But I'd argue that that's actually been true of a lot of incumbent governments across the West for the past several years. And all those governments now, not all, many are experiencing a significant pushback, right? And that's often described as populist pushback. You'll hear that term. Sometimes I think it's mischaracterized as far right or right wing. I don't think there's anything inherently right or left about the pushback. I would describe it more as a sovereigntist pushback, right? So saying basically, um, people have agency, communities that come from countries have agency, countries themselves have agency within the international system. And this whole thing about a transnational, supranational set of norms and rules and an international rules-based order and diffused authority where no one's really sure who's in charge, that kind of stuff. People are pushing back on that. And we're seeing that most clearly around immigration, but we're seeing it about around a number of other things too. And I think Trump is not, I mean, he's not solely an avatar of a bigger global wave, right? I mean, he's his own person. I think you can date the precise millisecond when he won the election to the 13th of July in Butler, Pennsylvania, right? Um, so, there's things that were unique to the US election process. But I do think one of the things that the US process shares with the rest of the world experience in the last year is people pushing back on this narrative of decline, and the reality of decline, and starting to try to retake agency themselves. Now that could go well, or it could go really, really badly, which is what I mean by I'm keeping an open mind right now. And there's a number of different ways in which it could go badly, and we can talk about them. But I think it's first worth recognizing that it might also go well, right? We might actually start to see um, a return of competence, a return of humility, a return of governments that are responsive to the will of their own populations, right? And to decisions made by where decisions made by government reflect, electoral choices. And again, I don't think you can characterize that as right wing or left wing, right? That would be considered just a bog standard, super obvious point, 20 years ago. But for whatever reason, it hasn't been lately. So, that's where I am right now. I'm sort of cautiously watching and waiting to see how things go. The thing that worries me right now, most of all, is around China. But I'm also watching the Middle East and Ukraine pretty closely, of course.
Yeah, on the subject of China, I hear from people who have been there, have done business there, varying stories. Some of whom say, like, basically, it's over. China, the scepter has been passed. China runs everything, and it's just like basically, we're waiting for the logic to unfold of their sort of inevitable dominance of the world. I have heard other people who have said, like, no, there's a lot of sort of plaster chipping and things that are not as ricketier than they look, and the demographic situation's a real problem. And yeah, so maybe you can comment on that. Like, what is your take on the strength of the Chinese position? How much of a problem it presents to the U.S. in the Trump administration?
Yeah, great thing, and worth mentioning, right? That one of Trump's greatest contributions to American foreign policy, which often goes without mentioning because people don't want to give him credit for it, but he reoriented the entire discourse in US politics around China, right? I mean, the rise of China to a position of global dominance, was something that was sort of accepted as inevitable or seen as not necessarily a bad thing by the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And then Trump comes in and goes, "Yeah, no, we're not doing that." And this is around the time, if you recall, in the 2020 election campaign when uh, Joe Biden said, "Well, they're not bad folks." Remember that whole thing? Like, don't that we can outcompete them. But that's um, noting his family connections to China. I'm not 100% sure that was a straight statement, but assuming that it
Right.
was, um, that reflected a point of view that existed pre-Trump, which was almost like a linear programming issue. Like China's inevitably going to overtake the United States. And we just have to basically either fight a cataclysmic world ending conflict against China, or we have to accept that. And obviously, no one wants to fight a cataclysmic world ending conflict. So let's just get with the program and start learning Mandarin, right? And in Australian strategic discourse, this is represented by a book called How to Defend Australia, which most of your listeners won't and don't need to care about. But emblematically, this is the notion that a world dominated by a US-led world order is inevitably coming to an end. China's going to take over. We just need to make our peace with that and decide what's the right point to jump from being a, American puppet to a Chinese puppet. And I rejected that at the time on the grounds of being A, bullshit, and B, pusillanimous crap, right? And a lot of other people did. But in fact, since then, a lot of data has come out that suggests that it's not an accurate reflection of reality anyway. So because of demographic reasons, as you mentioned, mainly the results of the one-child policy, but a couple of other factors as well. China's population is going to start declining. In fact, it already has started declining, but it'll start to sharply decline in the next 5 years or so. And projections are that by the end of the century, the United States will be around 700 million in population. China will be down around 500 million. So if you like the period of demographic growth and rapid, double digit GDP growth in China, which if you believe Chinese statistics, has been a thing for couple of decades, that's all coming to an end. So we're seeing their economy slowing, we're seeing population growth declining, significant structural weaknesses in terms of inland versus coastal, north versus south. And I think the other big thing in China is um, the artificial juicing of the Chinese economy through massive overproduction, right?
Right.
Which has basically led to this sort of period where they're reaching almost an element of exhaustion. So there's a thing in a US strategy called the Davidson window, put forward by an admiral called Davidson a few years ago, who said basically China's not going to overtake the United States. It's actually going to get to be the closest it ever gets to be able to take the US between about 2022 and the end of 2027, and then it's going to start to radically decline. So if there's a danger window in which we're going to fight China, it's going to be in that period. And you'll often
Mm.
hear people like Indo-PACOM and the Pentagon and elsewhere talking about the Davidson window. And I think it's a real thing. And it's a really important way of thinking about the problem. Like we may not necessarily fight China, but if we do, it's going to be soon. Um, this is where Trump getting elected, I think, is really relevant. The Chinese put a lot of effort into monitoring the state of demoralization, if you like, in Western culture, particularly the like they have all institutes of US studies that all they do is study the sort of Yuri Bezmenovization of Western cultures, right? Like just exactly how fucked up are they now? And you can see TikTok, for example, as an example of an attempt to undermine, um, you
Oh
know,
man.
vision.
The the friggin' Red Book thing.
Yeah,
I had people sending me like, drone shows from Shenzhen and white people being like, I can't believe how good it is here. And it's like, dude, wow, did you see the new Chinese propaganda from ChinesePropaganda.com? It's
right,
like
right.
I
Yeah,
couldn't believe like the credulousness of
yeah,
some of these takes
totally.
on China.
Totally. Now, that doesn't mean we should be banning it. I suspect there might be a bit of an ulterior, centralization motive behind that. But, you
Sure.
know, the point is that they spend a lot of effort thinking about, you know, how is morale, right? How is
Right.
declinism in the West? So one counterintuitive negative about Trump getting reelected is if Trump does in fact start to win the culture war, quote unquote, and starts to reinvigorate a pushback against declinism, and you start to see a rise in sovereigntism and nationalism and a reinvigoration of the US military, the Chinese may take that as a trigger to use it or lose it, right? Like if we don't move now, we will not have a Davidson window, and we're going to have to basically go for Taiwan, which is the sort of central psychic rejuvenization of the Chinese. And I think that's the risk, right? That if in fact we start to radically improve in our military performance in particular and our ability to mobilize global power, China may say, right, this is our last opportunity now to make the move, and we may actually see a conflict triggered quicker than it otherwise would have been before we're actually in a position to fight that conflict effectively. So, really long answer to a really short question. I have one more point, and then I'll shut the fuck up. Um, China, because of the one-child policy, has an army today that is the largest army in history to be composed of a majority of only children. Something like 70% of
Yeah.
Chinese military are only children. There's an active debate, right, about what does that mean. One theory is, okay, what that means is because the Chinese Communist Party controls the military, right? It's the PLA is the military of the party, not the state. Um, Everything they do is about preserving Communist Party control of China. So if it looks like they're going to lose like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people, um, they may decide not to take the risk because it could generate, a massive wave of unrest in mainland China if lots of people's only children get killed in a society that doesn't have a good social security safety net, right? So
Right.
there's an idea that there's a limit, right? To that the Chinese are actually more risk averse than they might appear. I tend to support that point of view, but I think there's a valid countervailing point of view which says, okay, but is it 10,000, 20,000, or 30,000? Like, what's the number, right?
Right.
Like, how many of these guys do we have to kill to make them back off? And therefore, how much of a credible threat do we need to pose to their ambition to retake Taiwan to have that deterrent effect where they rethink it, right? And like that's a live debate, and it comes down to stuff like, do we think it's mostly amphibious or mostly airborne? Do we think they start with a big cognitive warfare push? Do they go somewhere else at the same time, right? Like one possible theory would be if you're going to attack Taiwan and you know the US is going to respond, and this is your big showdown battle for the future of the human race, well, you know the US is going to respond from Guam, the Philippines, Darwin, Pearl Harbor, Okinawa. So why attack Taiwan and then wait for the US to respond? Why not attack all those places at the same
Right.
time, right? So, I mean, these are all the sort of incoming. The guy to watch, and this is a guy called Elbridge Colby, who's just been appointed as or just been nominated as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So the guy that's like the brain, and he's been a big China hawk and has some pretty sophisticated ideas about how to deter China from taking Taiwan. But I think, the macro picture is we may have just beaten the Chinese without a fight by becoming more, growing into our own, um, you know, uh, national sovereignty, or we may have actually triggered a countdown to something that's going to be a major crisis. I don't know the answer to what it's going to be yet. We need to sort of keep an eye on that.
Yeah, it seemed to me from reading your book, because you spent a lot of time on unrestricted warfare,
Yeah.
um, and sort of using that as, maybe that is or isn't like literally the manual the Chinese are using to sort of deal with us. But you sort of use it as a conceptual window to talk about all these different domains that they are. And just to recapitulate briefly, it's like you've got your fixing force and your flanking force. Your fixing force is, uh, well, in an actual military context, it's like the two lines of armies facing off, and then the flanking force is rolling up from the side, and the fixing force is to keep them there so they don't pivot and hit the flank.
Yeah.
In this concept of conceptual envelopment, we're saying China's going to keep us busy with carrier strike groups and hypersonics and airfields and F-35 and satellites and all that, like just to keep us dumping the money into it while they go buy real estate and dump fentanyl and dump migrants potentially and maybe fool around with some mRNA situations and so from that paradigm, like I get the sort of clock is ticking on this military conflict, but is it possible that even if they sort of pass that window, just by sort of being more creative and nimble and responsive, they're able to sort of create all these kinds of problems, even if there's not a direct military confrontation?
Yeah, that's a great point, mate. That's a really insightful way to think about it. So short answer, unrestricted warfare is not the manual, right? It is written as a think piece 20 years ago. The manual is actually a thing called the Science of Military Campaigns, which gets updated regularly. And there's also some really interesting Chinese military writing on what they call cognitive domain operations and how to basically shape, disrupt, disunify an adversary either ahead of or instead of a conventional activity. You're using appropriate terminology here of the fixing force and the flanking force. The Chinese equivalent of that from Sun Tzu is the notion of an ordinary and an extraordinary force. So the ordinary force is the military in this case. The extraordinary force is all the stuff that does what the Chinese, what unrestricted warfare calls trans-military and non-military war operations. So trade, supply chains, pandemic, control of critical technologies, real estate, agriculture, all that stuff, right? Um, and the one big difference though is in Western theory, you fix with the fixing force and you defeat with the flanking force, right? Um, in the Chinese model, you're actually trying to create optionality, right? So you have the fixing force or the ordinary force, you have the extraordinary force, and what you're trying to do is create a dilemma for the adversary so that whichever force he turns to face the other one can crush him from a flank, right? So it might be that their strategy has been we can demoralize, disrupt the West, destroy our cohesion in preparation for a conventional military strike on Taiwan.
Mm,
Or it might be the opposite, right? It might be hold our attention on Taiwan and on spending to outcompete the PLA while simultaneously doing all that stuff that you talked about. The reason I said it's really insightful thought is, and I suspect you are actually ahead of people in the Pentagon on this one, assuming that, which is not a high bar necessarily, assuming assuming that they don't meet the Davidson window, right? That they're not ready to move and that they're not able to make the conventional attack, what do they do then, right? Do they just roll over and go, oh, well, too bad, so sad, we tried, let's go back to, no, I doubt that they do that, right? I think
right.
they say, okay, we failed conventionally. Now let's run another cycle of demoralization and hybrid warfare to weaken the US further before we then take another bite at the apple, right? So I think it's wrong to think about it as a one-time event and a one-time window, which is what you tend to get from some of the official US publication. Now, there's guys in SOCOM and there's guys in other places that are much smarter about this than what you see in the published material. But I think there's certainly a line of thought that it's a one-time contest between the US and China. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. But certainly Trump being dropped like a you know, orange pebble into the pond significantly disrupts the wave motion that was happening already. And I think what we were seeing was a accelerating transition to multipolarity, right? Where the
Hmm.
US is no longer able to dominate a unipolar system, but neither is anybody else. So you start to get
Yeah.
these developing. Now, and I'm not sure if I think Trump sort of changes that trajectory, but I'm not sure if he can reverse 20, 30, 50 years of that process. Um, and I'm not sure that he wants to either. Like, it's not clear to me that Trump thinks that a US dominated unipolar world order where the US pays everybody's bills and secures the sea lanes and,
Right.
is actually good for the US, right? And it's pretty clear that a majority of the US population doesn't think that. Um, and
Right.
if Trump's been one thing since he got elected, since he was inaugurated, he's actually trying to execute some of his election promises, right? I'm not sure that he wants to go back to the status quo ante either, right? So I think we
Yeah.
do end up actually in this sort of multipolarity model.
Yeah, well, and there's almost like yes, there's like cultural trends and, America's sort of self-confidence isn't what it once was. China's much more self-confident. Like it's always talked about in these kind of like psychological terms, who's declining and who's rising. There's also just like the fact that our carrier strike groups have vulnerabilities they didn't have 10 years ago.
Yeah,
And
totally.
so, and like the whole deal of having a unipolar system where one party just guards the sea lanes and has uncontested dominance of the oceans is predicated on that technology, which, I, I don't know how much you want to comment on the situation in the Red Sea, but like I keep looking at that as like they I don't know what rank runs a carrier, but like the guy who runs the carrier out there was like, oh yeah, we're having Starbucks and here's these kind of chubby Zoomers. It's a regular day at the office for us. This is no, but he's clearly broadcasting like business as usual. Go back to sleep, everything's fine.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
they're totally like number one, they're not interdicting the sea lane. They're not stopping the blockade. People are still having to go all around the Horn of Africa. Um, and my read on that, just as a layman, is like nobody really wants to find out whether or not carriers are an obsolete technology right this minute.
yeah,
And like,
yeah.
and so
No,
we're just sort of keeping our distance and buying time. Is that your read? What do you think?
yeah. I mean, I think the naval, let's call it littoral, right? So the fight of navies in close inshore environments is a real canary in the coal mine for how traditional Western military capabilities and all those that copy them, right, are not fit for purpose, right, for the current environment. Um, so almost the stupidest thing that President Biden ever said, and that is a fucking high bar, but almost the stupidest thing that he ever said was he said something about like all you people who think you're going to overthrow the government, you need more than an AR-15. The government has F-16s, right? And I'm like, you just told anyone that knows what they're talking about that you don't have a fucking clue, right, about how this started.
Right. Or he
Particularly
thinks
since
we're
he's
stupid.
well, or particularly since he said that right after guys with literally AK-47s overthrew, a US-backed government in Afghanistan, by the way. Um,
Right.
but the broader point is big, overt, expensive, exquisitely, manufactured platforms of which we don't have very many, right, have become the sort of talismanic, symbolic, you know, mojo of Western militaries, right? And you see these guys coming out with small, stealthy, cheap, lots of them, right? Good enough, right? Systems. And twice in the last 2 years, we've seen an actor without a navy defeat a major world navy. I wouldn't call the Russians a major world navy, but let's give them that for the moment, right? For argument's sake. So we've seen the Ukrainians in the Black Sea and the Houthis in the Red Sea defeat in the field major navies. How did they do it? Large numbers of small, cheap weapon systems, a distributed network of small teams, right? And going up against, in the Russian case, not a very good military, but in the case of the US military, a military optimized for fighting small expeditionary wars of choice against non-technical technological equals, right? So without getting too in the weeds on it, ships have a thing called a VLS, a vertical launch system, right? And depending on the model of ship, it might be 32 or 48 or 96 cells, right? And what that means is they can launch missiles to defend themselves out of that vertical launch system. If you have a 96 cell VLS, the moment somebody launches 97 missiles at you, you're done, right? You can't launch a 97th one, you've run out. We, for reasons to do with the fact that we're complacent and in a war on terror where we're dealing with an adversary that didn't have a lot of these systems, bought a VLS or a version of VLS that cannot be reloaded at sea. So as soon as you fire your 96 missile, you're done. You have to go. You got to
Oh,
leave
geez.
the port, right? Winch in a whole bunch of new missiles in a alongside, in a port, and then come back on station to do your job. So literally, what happens, and this really does happen, is guys sit in little camouflaged observation posts on the coast of Yemen. They put binoculars up against the warship and they go, okay, that's a British Type 23 frigate. It's got a 32 cell VLS. I know that by looking it up on the internet. It's right here, right? And they call over, hey, Abdul, fire 33 missiles at it, right? And the moment you do that, it has to go, right? And this has happened repeatedly. So we've had 87 successful hits on ships in the Red Sea. We've had one sunk, sorry, one hijacked, two sunk. Um, the warships are successful at defending themselves, but they can't defend the commercial shipping that they've been sent to defend. So,
Right.
even if you haven't successfully, as a Houthi, haven't successfully sunk the, a carrier, although carriers are shooting down their own aircraft, right? Because they're getting, well, actually, it was a cruiser that shot down a US aircraft because people are getting confused about how many missiles are in the air. It's a really good illustration of what we call a saturation attack, right? And applied to China. Uh, China has two missiles that will destroy a carrier, the DF-21 and the DF-26. Slight differences between them. One's longer range and bigger, but both of them applied to a carrier will sink it. Um, the Chinese build a DF-21 or a DF-26 every 10 days. It takes us about, well, the Ford, which is the most recent carrier, took us 13 years to build, right? So they take, you know, they've got thousands of missiles to throw at any one of these
Right.
carriers. You're gambling that not a single missile will get through if you think you're going to be that close, and it's about a 2,000-mile range, right? So anywhere basically west of Guam or north of New Guinea, you're in the engagement bubble for Chinese land-based missile systems. That's even assuming they don't stealthily deploy them elsewhere, right? In the world, right?
Right.
And you either have to be willing to risk the loss of one of our 11 carriers or don't go there, right? Or you have to go and do to them what they're doing to us. So instead of big, few, expensive, overt, you go small, stealthy. So special forces approach, right?
Right.
Um, British have a thing called the Future Commando Force that's supposed to do that. We have a thing called the Marine Littoral Regiment that's out there operating in a similar manner. So small, stealthy teams trying to do to them what the Houthis have been doing to us. The problem has come down to political will. Politicians don't want to get engaged. They'd rather not worry about it. Um,
Right.
I'm worried that when we finally do engage, we'll suffer the same thing that the Russians suffered and that we've just suffered in the Red Sea, and be defeated by these guys with, small, cheap money.
Yeah, and I'm interested in your take on how the technology maybe changes, and this is a little bit abstract, but like it, it seems like the reason that the world got basically split between two superpowers in the 20th century was that all the returns to scale were enormous. Like if you just could be the biggest and the most expensive, then you could build the carriers, you could build the bombers and the fighters and the tanks. And that was what won wars. So it just naturally created this scale of the system. Now, as we're seeing like small, cheap many, um, it seems like you could go a couple of ways where it's like, well, maybe it's like high morale, high trust, willing to take risks, willing to get hurt, uh, in ways that sort of modern bureaucratic Western armies are not, and
Yeah.
maybe the Chinese are not. So maybe that means proxies, right? Other people who are willing to take risks and die instead of us. Um, or you could say like, no, it's still like it's drones. And so it's still manufacturing. So China's still going to win because they can just make more. They can make the most, and whoever makes the most wins. I don't know if you have a take on like how much does the technology change like what it takes to win?
So the technology itself, I think, alone doesn't change it. It's the combination of technologies, organizational structures, and tactics that all go together. And the three of those together generate an innovation. And if you can roll that innovation out, you tend to get, I talk about this a lot in Dragons and Snakes, right? You tend to get this kind of tit for tat co-evolution, right? Where um, people's techniques change all the time. And you can see that happening in real time right now with drones in Ukraine, where like 3 times a month, the way that the use of FPV drones and other drones on the ground in Ukraine is being updated because you have to. If you don't update the fill on your software-defined radio every day, the Russians will crack it the next day and you're done, right? Or the
Yeah.
Russians introduced a fiber optic controlled, like an actual wire-driven FPV drone to get around that electronic warfare. So we introduce something else. There's this constant like co-evolution at a massive rapid pace right now. I think there's a lot of focus on drones per se, and that's important, but I think drones are only one way in which we're seeing the same general like co-evolution happening. During the Cold War, there was this thing that people described as the stability instability paradox, which is kind of weird, but it's exactly what you said earlier, right? The more evenly matched and symmetrical the two superpowers were, and the more they were able to threaten mutual assured destruction with nuclear weapons, the less likely it was that you were going to have direct superpower conflict, right?
Right.
So that's the stability element. So instead of that, what you got was Vietnam, Korea, Malayan emergency, Cubans in Africa, proxy war, insurgency, wars of national liberation, as the Russians called them. So basically, the um, you might call it the conservation of animosity, right? Animosity between two great powers can't be destroyed; it can only be displaced, right? So if you're displacing it from the direct level of nuclear exchange, it's got to go somewhere. And in the Cold War, it went to proxy wars in the what was then called the Third World. Um, I think this is what's happening here, right? And getting back to the China discussion, if the struggle does not play out with conventional militaries and battleships and missiles, it's still going to play out. It's just going to play out in different ways, right? Hybrid, economic, irregular, proxy, special ops, intelligence, cyber, that kind of stuff. And I just don't think we can avoid the confrontation. It's just really
Yeah.
a question of what happens and what form it takes.
One of the things that I thought about with like the real estate and the even things like migration and like so I was in defense for a bit, uh finance drone ground level, but I got to go to all these like security trainings where they would be like, don't you spy for the Chinese, don't you spy for the Israelis, and it would be like, you know, Han guy spies for China, Jewish guy spies for Israel, Russian guy spies for Russia. And and
Yeah.
and and I think that there's elements of our system where the Chinese like in order for us to it's like Chinese individuals and Chinese companies and sometimes Chinese American individuals and companies buying this real estate, you know, coordinating in this sort of hostile way that is sort of confronting that would sort of be at odds with our like central ideology. Like it's hard to see how we could interfere with these sort of uh, mutually consensual individual transactions um, without really reconfiguring like who how we think of ourselves. And I don't know if you when you were writing that, were you thinking about that? Were you thinking about like what could we do about this kind of thing?
Yeah, I was a little bit. I think I tend to try and stay in my lane, which is obviously military analysis. But one of the key questions here is like, who is we in all these sentences that we're talking about, right? I mean, is
Right,
America a using America as an example, is America a proposition nation, right? Is it an idea, or is it a set of people who are descended from another set of people that were mostly Anglo-Saxon or European and have been joined and integrated with people from other parts of the world? But it's not just anyone that turns up. It's not just an economic unit. It is a real
right.
national unit, right? Um, and this is a thing. I mean, you hear this about the US, and I've lived here for 20 years. I've heard this. I've been a citizen for 10. I've heard this a lot from Americans. Weirdly, I once had an interaction with an HR professional in London, working for a big American firm in London, and she said, "Well, a lot of people are worried about Brexit, but what is an Englishman anyway? There's not really an English. Who are the English?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, but the English are a race, right? The English are they are the indigenous people of the British Isles, dude. That's what they are, right?"
Right.
So it's become sort of fashionable POMO, post-nationalist. I think Justin Trudeau, short to be the late unlamented Prime Minister of Canada, said, I want a post-national Canada, and I think Canadians are like, no, right?
Well, and then
Um,
as soon as Trump's talked about buying Canada or invading Canada, he was like all these like postmodern like post-national Canadians were like banging the drum like we know
yeah,
we're
totally.
definitely Canadians and it's a real thing. And it's so
Keep your filthy
funny.
foreign, keep your filthy foreign hands off my post-nationalist economic unit, right? I mean, yeah.
Right.
Nothing, and you see this with Greenland too, right? Nothing like Trump saying he wants to buy Greenland to fire up the Greenland independence movement and Dane's
Right.
control interest in controlling it. Um, yeah, but so I mean, Daryl Cooper, right, who does the Martyr
Yeah.
podcast. He has a great one on Epstein, and there's a section in it's like a three-part thing. He does these epic. He's
Oh,
not
it's an
quite Dan
incredible. I've watched it like 3 times or listened to it 3 times. Yeah.
he's not quite Dan Carlin level in terms of like 6 hour podcasts, but he's getting close. And there's one bit in there, I forget where it is, but he talks about how he's been through these defensive counterintelligence briefings, and they never say, well, okay, be careful of the Indian guy spying for India, or the Chinese American spying for China, or the Jewish guy, but he's like, but it's kind of a thing, right? And I think he's putting his finger there, and whatever your opinion of that particular issue is, he's putting his finger on that question of what do we mean by national identity here, and broader when you think about from an alliance standpoint. what do we mean by the West, right? I mean, this, I
Right.
actually, when I was writing Dragons and Snakes, had a bit of pushback from my editor, who was like, not my editor, actually, my copy editor, who was like, what do you even mean by the West? Like, what is the West? So I had to put this little note in there explaining up front, what do I mean by the West, right? And I think, so this gets back to there's a domestic US angle on this as well. But if we are indeed moving toward a multipolar system where governments are going to focus on competence and on their actual original mandate from their own population, and if you like, get back in their lane and focus on doing their actual, their limited number of functions, doing those well, that actually creates a lot more agency for smaller countries in the world system, like Australia, Canada, UK, right? That are no longer have to be in a single homogenous, beige block of the West, right? But can actually have more agency and pursue their own national interests, which arguably I think will make them better allies to the United States, right? Because they'll be more, capable.
Yeah.
But by analogy, people within the country, right? States, municipalities, cities, intentional communities, right? People that just want to be left alone and do their own thing, right? Will have a lot more agency if you're back in a more localized system where you've got perhaps a less powerful world institutions, maybe a less powerful central government with power kind of flowing to power, meaning accountability, right? Flowing to local communities, right? Where people know the people that are making decisions because it's them, right? And I
Right.
think, that's a vision that I think a lot of people have hoped for a while. It's utterly contrary to the vision that would have been imposed under a Harris administration. Whether you like Trump or not, I think, you can make the case that Trump doesn't want to get in your shit, or you can make the case that he's incapable of it, even if he wanted to, right? Too lazy. Either way, I think that it opens up space, right, for
Yeah.
people at a more local level in the world system, but also in the national systems of a lot of these countries that we're talking about.
Yeah. We were, I recorded on the Dragons and Snakes right in the thick of the UK protests over that that stabbing
Yeah, yeah,
um, earlier last year.
yeah. Horrible.
And yeah, it was terrible. And it was especially terrible to see protest uh and even like to some extent like resistance be criminalized and essentially like the bad guys won that round as far as I can tell. And thinking about like we were fascinated reading Out of the Mountains and Dragons and Snakes about to read about like Taliban and Hezbollah and all these organizations which obviously not morally exemplary but like
Mhm.
they had carved out something for themselves under really difficult circumstances. And I wonder if you have thoughts on like it was the UK protest movement there, was it just doomed to fail? Were there levers they could have pulled? Like, how do you resist a panopticon like that? How do you get breathing space under those conditions? Or do you? Does it like is it something where it has to kind of wait for the 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 hegemon to loosen its grip?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, we've seen a number of examples of pushback in the British Isles, right? Because I'm going to include Republic of Ireland here. Um, we saw in Scotland when the government radically expanded the online reporting of what are called non-crime hate incidents, which is kind of a weird formulation. And suddenly, like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were reporting the government itself as being engaged in hate crime against majority Scottish people. They had to shut the system down. It was overwhelmed. I forget the guy's name, but the chief minister of Scotland was voted out very shortly thereafter. So that's one pushback. In Ireland, you have like, I mean, the Irish know a thing or two about insurgency, right? And you have like mobs burning down asylum seeker residences and engaging in actual violent protests on the streets. as a result of, if you recall, there was a street attack that killed a couple of people, and the local community pushed back on it, and then the government cracked down on that. In the UK, you've got a much higher degree of surveillance control, partly weirdly going back to the 70s in reaction to the IRA. But you also have, I mean, probably the most heavily surveilled piece of urban real estate on the planet outside of China is the greater city of London. In terms of just the number of CCTV cameras and, location intelligence tracking and what we call
Right.
UTS, ubiquitous technical surveillance. Um, so, but the thing that I think was a bit weird in the UK is the criminalization of speech about violence as if it's equivalent to violence itself, right?
Right.
And
Just recording.
yeah, and one of the, or even just um, being aware of the content of radical material can be a crime, right?
Right.
And this is a big departure in English common law, and certainly a big departure from where the US or Australia or other places would be. Not Australia, not so much, unfortunately, lately. But it also goes against. I mean, one of the things I did when I was a strategist during the war on terror was to continually try to emphasize the problem here is violence. People can have whatever opinion they want, as long as they express that opinion peacefully and try to resolve their issues non-violently. We shouldn't, as the military, we shouldn't be shooting them in the head, right? Like this is not our role. And you should be opening up political discourse so that people can argue the case. Because when you really argue the case for some of the more extreme Al Qaeda positions, for example, they just fall over, right? It's laughably stupid. We, the West, don't need to do that because Muslims will do that, right? Thing called the Aman Declaration by the Islamic world, going on 20 years ago, pushed back on some of the craziness from Al Qaeda. Um, and I think what's happened is that the move away from violence being the problem to the belief systems being the problem has resulted in the criminalization of a whole range of belief systems.
Yeah.
In the US, that's resulted in the sort of disinformation industrial complex and also debanking of people, which seems to have been, if you believe what they're currently saying, seems to have been one of the motivations for the tech people in Silicon Valley to start backing Trump. I'm a
Yeah.
bit skeptical of that, but if that's true, then that's another illustration of that. So, going forward, I think that we're going to see more forms of pushback, right? And it won't be violent pushback necessarily. It might be, subversion of the dominant narrative in a place like the UK. I think the UK is interesting, but I would say that it's also worth keeping a close eye on Scandinavia. So,
Mm.
Norway, Sweden, Denmark, in particular, have had a massive influx of unintegrated, in some cases,
Right.
gang affiliated, violent foreigners over the last 10 years. And we're actually starting to see a really significant government pushback on that from elected officials, plus from the police, others. I mean, just one factoid, the Swedish police, the biggest problem they have to worry about right now is gang members wiping each other out with grenades and car bombs, right? This is in
Wow.
Sweden. And like, if you read the mainstream media on that, you'd be like, geez, I wonder what got into the Swedes, right? Well, nothing got into the Swedes. Swedes are the Swedes, right? What happened was hundreds of thousands of Somalis turned up not just Somalis, Syrians, and others. And if you come from a culture where you resolve disputes through car bombs in Mogadishu and you find yourself in Malmo, well, you can take the guy out of the civil war, but you can't necessarily take the civil war out of the guy, right? So,
Right.
I mean, this is the issue, right? So, it's not necessarily a done deal that this stuff can't be reversed.
Mm.
And one of the things that Trump does here is that he offers a demonstration effect, right?
Right.
And why I think we're seeing in lots of other places in Europe, people going, "Hey, yeah, we need to push back on this," and it very much, to be determined, right? How that's going to go. It
Right.
could go in either. Yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah, I think there's an extent to which Bukele made a difference in the States in terms of
Yep. Absolutely.
our window of what was possible. And
And
I
Miller.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
Mile too, yeah. And the Europeans, I think, are less likely to sort of less likely to take cues from Trump in particular. But from America. But things, as you see different things being tried by specifically like Western European nations, because like they can sort of turn up their nose at Orban, right? Like he's sort of a Slav, and they do things differently, and that's not who we are. But as you see like Germany, France, Denmark, England, Norway, Sweden, as you see them trying different things, and then their sort of local political constituencies have to be like, no, this isn't like, this isn't set in stone. This isn't how it has to be. Um,
Right.
there's other ways to handle this.
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of European leaders are actually looking to Canada right now. You'd
Mm,
be familiar with Pierre Poilievre, the head of the Conservatives in Canada, who he's not a Trumpy. He doesn't have a Trumpy affect, right?
right.
He's very articulate, very intellectual, very good at communicating complex ideas in simple language, but also very kind of insouciant about the POMO pushback from people that consider themselves to be, the right thinking, post-national Canadians.
Libtards.
And yeah, he's getting a lot of traffic and a lot of traction over there. So, and I think the Conservatives in the UK are looking particularly at him. I think there are other models beyond Trump, but I think uh, what we've seen is a sort of, we talked about this last time, a collapse of competence and therefore a collapse of confidence in elites, experts, institutions, how things are normally done, right? And it's like a moment of plasticity in the political system where lots of stuff that wasn't feasible a year ago and wouldn't have been feasible, under a second Biden term or a Harris term might actually temporarily be feasible. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? And it
Right.
could end really badly, but things are a little bit plastic for a moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, on the topic of we spoke offline about the collapse of the Assad regime,
Yeah.
and I think it's illustrative of it's a preference cascade. First of all, it's
Hmm.
everybody all at once deciding the war's over on both
Hmm.
sides,
Yep.
and you had some interesting things to say about how that uh, how that's indicative of how change can happen, how the HTS differentiated themselves from other extremist groups, how they sort of bided their time, how they built out the capacity, and then how they kind of knew when it was time to move.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and worth noting, of course, the content of people's ideology, you already made this point earlier, is not the same thing as their techniques. And we may or may not have anything to learn from their techniques. We would utterly reject the ideology of a lot of these groups, but that doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from them. Um, so, brief potted history of HTS, right? Founded in, well, grew out of several groups, right? They were all founded at the beginning of the Syrian civil war and split off from ISIS in 2014, February of 2014, and then split off from Al Qaeda in 2017. By 2017, you've got this emergence of this thing, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an alliance of different groups that are Islamist in their orientation, but they start to do some really different things. And they first caught my attention in 2014 when Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the guy that is now the interim head in Syria, said someone asked him, are you going to impose Sharia law and crush the unbelievers when you win against our side? And he said, no, no, no. Look, the job of the moment is to defeat the tyrant. And when the tyrant is defeated, then we as Syrians will all sit down together and we'll decide ourselves amongst ourselves what the future structure of Syria should be. And I was like, who the fuck are you? And where'd you come from? Right. And he was a guy who came out of Al Qaeda in Iraq, saw a lot of the negatives of the way that things were done by those guys, and came up with an alternative, which is traditionally would be considered a popular front model, right? So that you try to ally with anybody you can ally with. You don't make a big deal over minor differences of belief. You try to create a popular front and then try to liberate areas and push back against the regime. And they were extraordinarily effective for a couple of years. Then the Russians intervened, and they were pushed right back to one province only, Idlib. And that's the moment where I think some of the big lessons to be learned took place. The Instead of thinking about themselves as a armed resistance against the Assad regime, they started to talk about themselves as the hard shell, the hard military shell of a civil society resistance and renaissance against the regime. And they created a thing called the Salvation Government in Idlib, which had lots of factions in it, not just HTS. And HTS said, no, no, we're not here to tell you what to do. We're just here to be the protective layer that allows you guys to create in embryo what the new Syria is going to be, right? And like again, we would disagree with a lot of the ideological content of that, but the technique's interesting, right? Because they basically said HTS isn't going to overthrow Assad. The Syrian people are going to overthrow Assad, and we're going to protect them while they do it, right? Really
Yeah.
interesting idea, right? So they started to put a lot of effort into civil society stuff, economic, education, health, small business, agriculture, right? And they had like something like 12 or 13 ministries doing that, plus reconstruction, with HCS sort of staying in its own lane and being that hard shell while they built a parallel society that was sort of the new Syria in embryo. Um, then the moment came when the Assad regime was lazy, they were corrupt, they were low morale, and their main protectors, Iran and Russia, were distracted. Russia, obviously, focusing on their impending victory in Ukraine, putting all their effort into that, not in a position to react and bail out the Assad regime like they'd done multiple times before. The Iranians just getting their asses kicked in Lebanon through the war with Israel. Uh, the stuff going on in Hamas with Hamas in Gaza, putting their effort into the Houthis, like otherwise distracted, engaging in direct fighting against Israel, from April last year in a unprecedented way. So the moment emerged where you had the two protectors of the Assad regime not able to help them out, the third protector, Hezbollah, heavily damaged. And at some point, the leadership within HDS were like, this is our moment. And they moved initially on the city of Aleppo, which is only like 20 miles from Idlib. So it wasn't a big shock, I think, to the regime, although it was obviously a major blow. The really big shock was when they suddenly jumped like 140 miles to the city of Hama and then again to Homs, which is even further south, on the route to Damascus in a matter of like 4 days. And that delivered a massive psychological shock to the regime, which triggered what you talked about, the preference cascade. So that's just a political science thing about, you know, and the misinformation, disinformation guys would be well to remember this, right? In an environment where dissent is suppressed, and only one official narrative is allowed, people know that they dissent, but they think they're the only one.
Right.
And then suddenly something happens and they realize, hey, shit, everybody else dissents as well. And the overt appearance of consensus collapses rapidly, right? And once that happens, you get to what I think is the critical moment, which is when the security forces have to make a decision about whether they're going to support the regime or not. And if you haven't been in the military or the police, you tend to think about them as unitary instruments of the repressive regime, but they're not, right? They're people that have families, that have kids in school, that need to protect their families, and at some point they start looking over their shoulder, and they're like, "Am I willing to die for this regime?" And when you hit that critical moment where the security forces no longer want to fight on behalf of the regime, that's when everything collapses. And that moment happened on like the night of the 7th of December in Damascus, where you literally had Syrian civilians Googling online how to drive a T-72 tank because there were so many abandoned tanks in the main streets of Damascus that people are like, shit, I need to drive this tank out of the way so I can get off the street. And all the military had just evaporated, right? So people are like, Googling
Wow.
like how to drive tanks. So I mean, that's the moment where it all collapsed. And it happened in a week, right? Or 2 weeks, really, about 10 days. Um, I referred to in a piece that I wrote for the Aussie newspaper, The Australian. to a guy called Gordon McCormick, who's an academic at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, wrote a great paper like 20 years ago called Things Fall Apart about the end game dynamics. And like that's what happened in Afghanistan, right? The whole country collapsed in 11 days. That's what happened here in about the same time frame, weirdly, where as soon as things start to unravel, they just cascade, unravel, and fall apart. So I think there's a lesson here for everybody, whether you support the HTS ideology or not, and I don't, obviously, which is that what did they do? They didn't keep battering themselves against the brick wall of a regime that was strong and supported by Russia and Iran. They took a breather, exited right from that construct into a haven where they were able to create a hard shell. Then they focused on the non-military aspects, building a real network, building a real community, generating that cohesion, the asabiya, as we talk about, to give them the strength of cohesion to react. And the military guys define themselves as secondary, right? We're not here to
Yeah.
run a military activity against the regime. We're here to protect the civilians while they build the new society. And then when the moment struck, they were agile and ready enough to react. Now, other things happened, right? They had support from Turkey. They probably had a lot of support from Ukraine. They may have had some support from the US. It's hard to know. But so it wasn't just that. But I think if there's a lesson, it's bide your time, ripeness is all, as they say, and
Yeah.
read the environment and be ready for it. But I also think it is actually a true statement, right, that an armed resistance is not there to overthrow the regime by itself. It's going to be like thinking about Afghanistan. The Afghan people are going to overthrow the Taliban, right? It's not going to be the small, the Afghan United Front or the Afghan Freedom Front, the guys that are currently fighting them. Those guys can be the hard shell when the people of Afghanistan decide to, stand up and shake these fuckers off, right? And you see this everywhere. So I think that's something we can take to the bank, as it were, as a something that translates from one environment to another, because we've seen it in lots of different places. I'll leave it to you guys as to what lessons you want to draw for your own life. I mean, we're not in that circumstance here in
Sure.
the US, but there are definitely lessons I think on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one that strikes me as really apropos is the Popular Front, the idea of maintaining a big tent. Because like, the Sunnis are, I think, a bare majority in Syria. It's like 60%, right? Are Sunni,
Depends if
something
you
like
count,
that.
depends if you count Kurds or not, but yeah, I mean, if Sunni Arabs are not a majority, but Sunnis writ large, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that we're up against right now is like all of a sudden we're in power, decisions are starting to be made. And I say we, right? That's the question. Who's we?
Mm.
Um, the Trump administration is taking control. They're starting to make decisions that reflect the interests of various constituencies. And there's a lot of fighting about it because it's like, who are we really? Who is this coalition? Can we hold together? And like, so you can treat like building a popular front as like, well, that would just be this thing to do. Like, obviously you want the biggest tent possible. You want as many people, but like there's trade-offs and there's complexities and it's hard to do. So I wonder if you have thoughts about how how that got built in this case. Like how did they go from, because like, certainly from over here, this guy went from dangerous bearded ISIS terrorist to he's wearing the like Fidel Castro jumper and he's like a freedom fighter and it's all
Right.
about and some of that's branding on our side, but like he actually did have to get the approval and the consent of people who were not like wild-eyed ISIS fundamentalist guys. So how did that happen?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, it happened through a consolidation of multiple non-ISIS factions who all disagreed on various things, but came together around what were called operations rooms in the campaign of 2015, where they started to operate together, and then they built a political alliance from tactical cooperation. And different groups left at different times, right, and said, "Yeah, no, fuck this, I'm not doing that," and they split back to ISIS or back to Al Qaeda. Um, but the fundamental was what like they agreed on what they could agree on, and they set aside things they didn't agree on. I remember one time the HCS guys, actually it was before they were HCS, group called Jabhat al-Nusra, had a public debate with a bunch of guys who had a different point of view on Sharia law, right? And I'm like, who are you people, right? Like, like the imagine ISIS. I mean, ISIS would invite you to a public debate, and they'd fucking cut your head off, right? I mean, so this is weird. The other weird thing they did, and I thought this was hilarious at the time, um, the way that we designate terrorist groups is by name, right? That's how it works, right? So there's a UN process to do that. There's a US government process. Takes like minimum 6 to 9 months, usually a lot longer, to designate a new terrorist group. So this happened like 3 or 4 times. Every time they got designated, they'd be like, "Oh, name change, new name," right? And they're like, "Oh, fuck," and we'd have to go back to the go through that whole process again. They did it like 3 times, right?
It's
And
amazing.
this partly Jelani going, "Hey, I saw you guys coming, right? Like I know how your system works." But it was partly also them trying to avoid the terrorist designation. So unlike ISIS, which proudly adopted that and made it part of their identity, these guys were like, "Yeah, we're not terrorists, right?" And they kept on trying to like move outside of that. Now you've got them sitting in suits in Davos, right? There's a guy
Right.
from HBS speaking at the WEF right now, like it's crazy.
That is wild.
So. Yeah, but so I think building points of agreement where you can, um, picking your battles on areas where you disagree, and then try to avoid the eye of Sauron, for want of a better term. Like try to stay out of the focus. And again, this comes back to a different ideology and a different theology actually on their part. But we can get into that if you want. But ISIS thinks that the way you win is by proving to Allah that you're worthy, and then He'll
Right.
deliver the victory, right? These guys think no, no, it's regular military strategy here. Yeah.
I really think that there's an analogy in this concept of operational platoons.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of because like when I think about there was a great podcast by a friend of mine on the subject of ethnogenesis, how does a people become a people?
Hmm. Yeah.
And basically it was like, well, in on the frontier, the Comanche decided who was an American because that's just who got scalped. And so like if your homestead is under attack and the Germans show up and they help, you're on the same team. Like that's just like that's how those ties are bonded and created. And
Yeah. Yeah.
you see that a lot with GWOT guys, where they will have very different views on race and nationality, and because of the guys they worked with and fought with.
Yep.
And so I wonder if you could speak to the operational platoons a little bit, like what did they do together? How did they? And obviously, like if it's like go build bombs, I'm not saying go build bombs, but like I think
Yeah.
there is something to this, like do projects together, build things together, so you can figure out who you actually, who's credible, who's smart, who's aligned, that kind of thing. Can you speak to
Yeah.
that?
I can. And just one aside up front, I know you didn't mean this, but people that don't know a lot of GWAT veterans, when you say you have a different attitude to race than a lot of other people, are going to think, oh, those fuckers, they're all racist, right? It's actually the opposite, by
Yeah,
far
that's
the
what I
opposite.
meant. The other
I
way,
know
the
that.
other way. Right,
I know that's what you meant, yeah. But just to be clear, right? Because when you're in Afghanistan in a fob and someone's shooting at you from outside the wire, the question "who is we" is a really easy question to answer, right? It's all of us inside the wire that are getting shot at,
right.
black, white, Jewish, Muslim,
Exactly.
whatever. Right? And there's nothing like an external enemy, targeting you to make you unify. That's a whole principle in anthropology, and this
Right,
notion of ethnogenesis is that iron sharpens iron and nations become nations by confronting other nations, right? And that's how you learn. And, by nation, I just mean an extended kinship network, right? People that are related
right.
to each other, whatever number of removes. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of lessons from the so you can do a top-down model where you build operational capability through a broad political alliance. That is often not how it works in these kinds of situations. What often happens is that you find yourself in a political alliance through bottom up cooperation in combat. And I'll just give you one concrete example, the Battle of Amaria in June of 2007 in Baghdad. Not a widely known battle, but a guy called Dale Cool was commanding a battalion of cavalry in downtown Baghdad in this district called Amaria. When a bunch of guys came to him and said, "Hey, we just want to let you know, local Iraqis, right? We're gonna come out on the street tomorrow. We are gonna fight Al Qaeda. We don't want your help. We just want you to stay out of the way because we're not Al Qaeda, right?" The following day, they came out and instead of 400 people that they claimed they had about 40. They fought Al Qaeda. They lost. They were about to be slaughtered in the streets. And Dale was like, "Yeah, I can't let that happen on my watch." So he intervened, and the Cav unit that was there, First Fifth Cav, intervened and fought alongside these guys against Al Qaeda for a day. At the end of the day, they're in a mosque all together, sharing water, sharing ammo. They've just fought Al Qaeda and pushed them back from the network. Only then do they realize that the guys that they've been allied with all day is the 1920s Revolutionary Brigade, which is another insurgent group, right, that we've been fighting for like 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And at that point, we were like, well, what do we do here? And that was the moment at which the so-called awakening hit Baghdad, because those guys were like, we want you guys to leave Iraq. And we were like, hey, we want to leave too, dude. All we got to do here is make it safe enough that we can go and we're out of here. And they were like, right, well, let's partner up. And this whole so-called awakening was a bottom-up phenomenon that happened through many, many different instances of this local level collaboration of people pushing back against the terrorists and finding common ground. And then the political movement that later became known as the Sons of Iraq emerged from that bottom up. Now it was crushed later, right? It was crushed by the pro-Iranian factions in the Iraqi government after we left. But for a period there, it was this sort of bottom up political movement of collaboration amongst local groups that led to a broader political alliance. In my experience, that's actually more common than our theory gives it credit for, right?
Yeah.
It's usually not that people have common political ideology and that makes them form operational partnerships. It's usually the other way around, right? The other people on the PTA, the other parents that are waiting in the pickup line, the other guys that run small businesses in your neighborhood or whatever. You end up with a common set of interests at the local level, and sometimes that propagates up to a higher level political alliance. Sometimes it doesn't, right? And I'm sort of a bit of a radical localist. I think even if it doesn't percolate up, it doesn't really matter, right? If it's better for your family at the local level, it's better.
Yeah.
Um, but in fact, in the environment, we do actually see that it does often proliferate up. Yeah.
There's, I think there's a connection to be drawn between and I don't know if this was your coinage, but the theory of competitive control
Mhm.
from your first book or from the first book I read,
Yep.
um, where it's about keeping the bubble inside a nicer place to be than on the outside. And you can do that by punishing people who are on the outside, or you can do it by protecting the people and giving them a good environment on the inside.
Yep.
And one of the things that's you see in like your story about Hezbollah, your story about HTS, is that like when things are like really shitty on the outside, it actually like you don't actually have to make that worse. You can focus on making the inside better, and that's good enough to create that cohesion. And I think one of the like I've just observed this like the level of political cooperation across like people with very different religious views, very different to some extent economic and political views. Uh, it's really grown just because it's so bad on the outside that it's like we got to do something, and like you sort of stop caring about that. Like
Hmm.
we can figure that out later. And
Yeah.
uh, and I think you're definitely seeing that with this like more traditional right wing pairing with like the tech
Yeah.
people. It's like there's this mutual enemy that's not even necessarily like it's not like the libs or the demo. It's like this
Yeah.
impending cliff that we're all heading toward. That's
Well,
the enemy.
absolutely. And you see, I mean, it's almost like a coalition of common sense, right? And you see people that would self-describe as leftists, right? Matt Taibbi, for example, right? Um, and or Walter Kern, who's probably center left to center, right? I mean, I would have been considered middle of the road centrist like 10 years ago, right? The people going, this is just crazy, right? And I actually think the left-right distinction makes a lot less sense now than it did. And I think that people are starting to collaborate across traditional political lines. Now, history tells us, and all the same stuff that we've just been talking about tells us that that collaboration is likely to be temporary, right? It's likely to be imposed by an external threat that's greater than the internal divisions. And when that external threat goes away, those internal divisions will come back, right? And that's okay, right? I mean, that's how it works, right? So I'm not, sort of threat-induced unity, right, is going to potentially go away and probably should, right, at some point, because that means that the big threat's gone away. Um, but
Do you
I
think that
also
happens
think
in
that,
Syria?
yeah, oh, I do, definitely. I mean, we're seeing a short-term, temporary, tactical alliances of convenience that are going to go by the wayside the moment things settle down a bit. Absolutely, yeah. That's why the Israelis spent the first month after the collapse of the Assad government bombing the absolute shit out of Syria to destroy their air defenses, their navy, their tanks, everything else. Because, like, at some point, some actor is going to take charge again in Damascus that's not going to be friendly to their interests, right? So take advantage while you can. No doubt about that. The unity will fall apart. The other thing that I would say is it Psalm 146? I forget which one it is, but it's like, put not your trust in princes, right? Like, the real shit happens at the local level amongst people that know each other, that live in the same communities.
Yeah.
And it is, there are two equal and opposite lunacies out there right now. One is people that are lying in a dark room with a wet towel on their forehead, thinking that Trump's going to turn into Hitler 2.0 and, ship everybody off to the boxcars and all that.
Yeah.
Um, Laziest guy in history issues executive orders, right? Like, no, that's not going to happen. Then the alternative is people that are like almost the QAnon types that are like, the plan, it's working, and it's all gonna, and all we're gonna do is sit back and Trump's gonna deliver. Like, sorry, like, no, that's not gonna happen either, right? At
Yeah.
the best thing I think you can say about the current moment is that the boot is off the neck
Yeah.
temporarily, and now is the time to consolidate, work together, build those networks because no one's coming to save us, not even Trump, right? Or not anyone, it doesn't matter whether you like Trump or don't. And as you know, I'm pretty much try to be nonpartisan in U.S. Domestic politics, partly because I just got here. I'm a foreigner by background, and I don't think I should be expressing an opinion on American politics. But also because uh, it's not really appropriate for guys that are in our line of work, my line of work, to be, expressing opinions on what people's political beliefs should be. Like, that's up to people to figure that out for themselves. But I do think that the lesson of 25 years of war, in my case, is any relief is temporary. Things are never as good or as bad as they seem.
Yeah.
And whenever you have the opportunity, you should always be building, always be unifying, always be prepping because, the wind's going to change again. And I don't mean that in a military sense. Right? I'm not talking about like, rebuild the militia movement, right? That was a movement of its time of the 1990s. This is different.
Sure.
But it means cohesion. It means networking. You guys spend a lot of time talking about this, and I fully support all the stuff you guys are saying amongst yourselves about how this should be. But I think it has broader application too now, right, to everybody. And it is a way of thinking about the problem writ large.
Yes. Well, I think that's a great place to close. Yeah, I definitely co-sign all of that. I think it is what like whether you believe in sort of the optimistic case or the pessimistic case, like on the other side of that, you'll be glad that you put in the effort. You'll be glad that you made friends. You'll be glad that you built capacity. Like it, it, whether it's the good timeline or the bad timeline, either way. Um,
Yep.
I really appreciate you taking this time. This has been fantastic conversation. I feel like I've learned a ton. Is there a book or somewhere we can point people to learn more about what you got going on?
Yeah, I've written a couple books recently, but not really along the lines of this stuff. Let me fling you a couple of things I wrote for the big newspaper in Australia, The Australian. One is that thing about Syria. The other one's a more recent thing about how I see the world in the next year under Trump, which touches on some of the stuff that we've talked about. I am working on a book on resistance warfare, mainly because you probably know I spent a bit of time in Ukraine with resistance groups, and I spent a bit of time in other places. And there's a new uh, approach to resistance that's emerging now, partly because of this technology stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
That my community, the special ops community, needs to be thinking about a little bit differently than we have historically done. So that will come out at some point, but it won't be soon. But I'm happy to give you guys a preview of my thinking whenever you feel like it.
Oh yeah.
And I'll just say it goes both ways. I mean, I've learned a lot from listening to the discussion around stuff you've said and the way you guys are thinking at it and the way that, because we're not talking about warfare here, we're talking about this peaceful politics, but there's a lot
Yeah.
of commonalities, right? There's a lot of things that resonate on both sides. And I think, frankly, it doesn't matter if you're left or right or whether you like Trump or don't like Trump. There's a lot of lessons here that everybody should be taking, right? Family, community, capability, bottom up, don't
Yeah.
rely on, impersonal big systems to deliver. Work your own problem yourself and wait for the opportunity, right?
Yeah.
When things are aligned. Yeah.
Well, I think very soon we're going to have you back for a Q&A with the guys. That was
Yeah,
tremendous.
awesome.
The guys really loved it. And yeah, can't wait to read that book.
Yeah,
It's
thanks,
great
man.
talking to you, man.
Thanks for having me back. All right. Cheers.